Next up, moderated by Elliot Foup, we are going to have a panel on the view from congressional staff on industrial control systems. This is really touching on one of the keystones for Hack the Capitol, which is we are trying to bridge that gap between policymakers and the technical community. Well, who really runs Washington? It's the staffers. And so Elliot, Sarah, and Nick, come on, the show is yours. And for those of you who haven't seen it in a long time, hi, it's been a while.
What's up? You and Nick got the beard going.
Nick, I don't think you really have a beard.
Yeah, right. I gotta work on it.
You do. Jumanji 3 is coming out soon, okay? Got a chance.
Awesome. Thanks, Bryson. So we gave, obviously this panel's got a very generic name, a view from congressional staff, so we're very creative. My name's Elliot. I work for Congressman Dutch Ruppersberger from Maryland. And we've got Nick Leisterson from Congressman Langevin's office and Sarah Moxley from the Committee on Homeland Security. Since there's only two of you, Nick and Sarah, do you guys want to give a quick introduction so folks know a little bit about your background and what you do on Capitol Hill?
Sure, I can go first. As Elliot said, my name is Sarah Moxley, and I am the subcommittee staff director for the cybersecurity subcommittee at the Committee for Homeland Security. My job is actually a lot of learning and then a lot of translating what I'm learning to members of Congress. And so I spend most of my time talking to people, reading to people, or reading what people and practitioners have put out there and trying to better understand it and put it into policy terms for members of Congress, and using that to shift through and find evidence. I've been on the Hill almost 15 years now, which I still can't believe. I think something might be wrong with me, but love the technology in the cyberspace. This is an area where I have learned so much and am grateful to be here today.
Nick?
Yep, I'm Nick Leisterson. I work as Congressman Langevin's legislative director. He is one of two congressmen from Rhode Island and has had cybersecurity as a major focus of his for the past dozen years, slightly more than that. I've been with him for 10 years as his legislative director. I'm basically his chief policy advisor, but my focus is really on cybersecurity and homeland security issues. And I have been interested in the topic for a very long time. I got the job through really geographic nepotism, as is the way on the Hill. I went to school in Rhode Island. The congressman is from Rhode Island. I really did not expect that he was going to be a big cyber guy. I did not think of Rhode Island as a hotbed of cybersecurity interests, but I have always had an interest, or I had even then an interest in the topic because I have a degree in computer science and I took some public policy classes in college that were focused on privacy and security policy. And it was readily apparent to me that even though the public policy department and the computer science department were approximately a block and a half from each other, there was virtually no communication between the two. And the concerns that the policy folks had on, hey, look at all these horrible things that can happen in our connected world with insecure code, were not being reflected in the software engineering curriculum that I was being taught, where we spent approximately 1.5 lectures, 2 hours, working on, like, mentioning, oh, secure software development, yeah, that's a thing. You might get asked about it in an interview. Here's how not to look like an idiot. But it doesn't matter that much, just make sure it runs. If it compiles, you pass your tests, you're good. So thanks, Elliot, for having us.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you both for the introduction. Certainly bridging the gap between the policy community and the information security community has, we're doing everything that we can to always try to create more avenues for conversation there. And certainly this is hopefully one of them with Hack the Capitol. One of the things I always like to talk about when I get together with folks from the information security community or cybersecurity community and Hill staffers is kind of a better understanding of what a congressional office actually does and what congressional committees actually do. So when people think of government, a lot of times they think, on cybersecurity policy, there are teams or hundreds of people that are dealing on complicated cybersecurity policy issues. And what I always like to do is make sure they know that most members of Congress have one person that handles cybersecurity policy, and that person may just be someone who's worked for the congressman for a long time or a congresswoman for a long time. They may not have an extensive background in cybersecurity. So it's kind of each member offices run their own particular way, and for that reason, there's a lot of different flavors of cybersecurity policy and policy management on Capitol Hill. So can you, with cyber being kind of one of the more pioneering issues, I know it sounds crazy to say that, but on the Hill, can each of you kind of explain, what a normal day is like for you and how you always try to move the ball forward to give people a little bit better understanding of what kind of we do on a daily basis. Sarah, if you want to start, that'd be great.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll say I'm one of those people that kind of happened in the cybersecurity and in the info security and technology space. And so really, and I work on a committee that has a lot of jurisdiction over cyber. I was a team of one for the majority of this Congress, hired a second staffer to join my team in, I guess, March of this year. So that gives you an idea of maybe the limited people that we had necessarily working towards this. Fortunately, I'm thankful for folks like the ICS community and all that, because y'all are the people that we lean on and ask questions on that. So a normal day for me is really, some of that is dependent on what are the goals of that month or week. So are we having a hearing on a particular topic? If there is a hearing, it is my role to find witnesses, to talk to the witnesses, walk through the testimony. What is the narrative that we're trying to get out here on that issue? And so that can involve a lot of research, that can involve a lot of talking with folks, and it's talking with members, trying to see what do they need to get out of this, what is happening in their districts that may affect the conversations that we're having or that are important to bring up. A great example of this is we had a hearing at some last year on state and local cybersecurity. And for Ranking Member Katko, his district had school district had just suffered a ransomware attack. So how does that play in? And that is also a great tool then for how can we bring the members further into this discussion, because here's something that's really personal to them. And I would say as a committee staffer, it's often trying to find what are those personal connections for members so I can try and engage my committee in a deeper, more substantive way. And then the rest of my time is really spent taking these conversations and making them more palpable for the staff that is not cybersecurity. I think Nick is such a value because of his computer science degree, but I don't know that any of the staffers for my members have that sort of background or knowledge. So what am I doing to take the great information that I'm learning from so many folks and making it a little bit more understandable in some ways? I mean, I'm basically a translator. How do you translate technology and these conversations into policy speak and show the value that it has for members, individual districts, or their aspirations, because that is how we get them involved. And ultimately, the more involvement I have with members, the harder it makes my life, but the better it makes it in the long run, because I want them engaged. That's how we get change to happen.
Yeah, Nick, give your perspective from being in a personal office instead of on a committee.
Sure. So half my life is my legislative director hat. So outside of providing direct policy advice on the areas I actually am a pseudo Hill expert on. So what does that look like? That means, tracking the other legislative efforts of our policy staff, sending the congressman vote recommendations based on what's going on the floor. I did that literally right before I logged on. Dealing, having an eye into all of the public statements that are being made from our office, whether it's on social media or a press statement or an interview or something else that's happening, to make sure that from a policy standpoint, what we're saying is accurately reflecting what the congressman is doing. So that's half my life. The other half of my life, the more fun part, is when I'm working on the issues that are of importance to congressmen. So what does that look like? I mean, for him, cybersecurity is at the top of the list, and that's great for me. So we have, I have a lot of meetings with people that vary from people that are in the community, whether it's in industry or think tanks, or folks that reach out to us and say, hey, did you know about this cool thing? Not as many constituents as I would like, but we know the Rhode Island cyber community is not as large as it should be, but it's very tight, and we know a lot of those folks. But around the country, there are just not enough members that spend a lot of time on this. So we get a wide variety of people that are like, hey, check out this cool policy idea or this nifty thing that we're doing. So I do a lot of that on kind of the passive end, people coming to me, and then more on the active end, what's been occupying an inordinate amount of time of late is helping to implement recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which is kind of a blue ribbon panel that my boss was one of 4 legislators on, and we have a lot of recommendations that came out of that. So that on the more active side, less receiving what's going on and trying to make sure I'm up to date. On the active side, it's how do we draft legislation that actually implements these recommendations? Who are the stakeholders we have to talk to, whether it's on the committees of jurisdiction, in a very intra-Hill sense, or on the relevant member staff, to the administration, and what do they think of this, to other stakeholders who might be affected by the legislation. And that is, very rewarding. That is policy making. And I think you need a balance of both, for sure. Like, if I am not keeping up to date on what's going on, then I'm not going to be providing very good advice to my boss. But the parts that are most fun are when, you take a Solarium recommendation and like, all right, let's, nerd out on this and figure out how to actually do something with the levers that Congress has to make the internet more secure.
Yeah, great points. And like you pointed out, it's a very delicate process, right, between involving all the necessary stakeholders to make sure you're informed when you're creating policy and you're not doing anything that's harmful to the community. But there, especially from folks, around the country, when they look at, DC and Capitol Hill, there's always this perception that, like, a lot of times people don't talk to each other, or we don't utilize all the necessary relationships kind of through the policy process as we should sometimes. But in the cybersecurity space, one of the things I've learned, I've been handling the cybersecurity portfolio for my boss for about 5 years, is how important kind of involving the information security community with us during the policymaking process is to actually getting to the point where we're able to make informed recommendations like those from the Solarium Commission and other of the various reports that come out of DC think tanks, whether it's from downtown or it's an academic think tank, or it's from the different various committees in Congress. So, Sarah, can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been like working with the information security community, or pulling kind of practitioners into the policymaking process? Because sometimes a committee hearing happens, right, and then all over the web, it's like everyone making fun of a member for, making assumptions about how Facebook operates, or any other social network, but making fun of them for not understanding how the internet works. So other than kind of informing members on how things operate and how they move the ball forward, how do you as a committee staffer try to bring in the information security community to the policy making process? And that was a very long question.
No, that's great. I will say having a member mocked because they don't understand Facebook in a hearing is my nightmare, and one that I hope never to actually come to fruition. So in probably the first 4 or 5 years of handling this issue, I did so more from a commercial perspective. And I'll be honest, at that point in time, I didn't know the information security community near as well as I should have. And like I can look back and see like my own growth as a staffer, but also how those relationships were better built. Some of that happened because I then moved from the job where I started really getting into this topic into to work for Congressman Will Hurd. And he, I think, like Congressman Langevin, attracts people who want to talk about these things, partly because he understands it. And so that's really where I think I first to see the value of how can we work with information security, that it's not just necessarily the makers of the technology, it's not the users, but how can this really talented group of folks who are seeing things that I wouldn't even think to look for. I will tell you, last year at DEF CON was astounded by how people think to, like, I want to know how this website works. Maybe I should see if I can get into it. It's never crossed my mind to do that. And I regret that it's never crossed my mind to do that. But having those relationships with the info security community, the Wilson Center has been a great way that that's happened to connect staffers like me who really had no clue how to reach out to this community to that and start to learn and to grow. It's being able to go to DEF CON both last year and then honestly, I think this year's DEF CON being virtual, while disappointing in some ways, was so much more accessible. So for so many more staffers. Most staffers have never heard of DEF CON, fewer, and they're cyber staffers technically. That was a great experience and I think helpful in making those connections. Because honestly, that value, I think there's a policy Slack in information security that is seriously one of the places where I learned so much. I'm not an info security, I guess, technologist. That's not my background. And as much as I try to learn about coding and have taken these classes and tried to do that, at the end of the day, that's not ever going to be my biggest strength. So having these relationships, building that, learning, knowing that there's people that I can go and I can ask these questions without being mocked is so hugely important because it allows me to learn in a way that I otherwise would not get an opportunity to. And I would say building those relationships, the in-person stuff has certainly helped. I'm thankful for the pre-corona times where I actually got to see and talk to people and see the demonstrations and get, your hands dirty as you're watching people and they're telling you how to do this. But I'm also thankful for the innovations we've had to think of in the current times and that there is an easy Slack where I can ask dumb questions and figure out the way forward. And that builds those connections so that everybody is really just an email or a phone call away for when there is that question, when there's that vulnerability disclosure. Can I ask about why you think CISA's BOD on the vulnerability disclosure should be X, Y, or Z? What is the way that should look like? What are the questions I'm not asking? Honestly, that is one of my favorite questions to ask people, especially in this community, because there's lots of things I have never thought of, and it's so valuable. I know I've said so valuable several times now, but that's true, and I am so appreciative of those and hope to continue to build more and more of those relationships so that there's more people that answer my questions, because that makes me a better staffer, which makes my members more informed members and less likely to say stupid things at hearings, which is always good for everybody, but then it also hopefully leads to better policy.
Yeah. Nick, can you give your perspective as someone, with your background, you're kind of, I assume, informally at least or loosely connected to the practitioners, even though you're kind of on the inside as a policymaker. So can you talk about some, so I know, as Sarah mentioned earlier, like, I text you all the time about cyber questions, and you're a great asset to the Hill and the staffers on the Hill that handle the portfolio. So can you talk about, kind of how the dynamic has changed? You've been here for a little while, in terms of bridging the divide between the security community and the policy community.
Yeah.
I promise we'll move to Solarium Commission.
Good. Like, first of all, there is still a divide, right? Like, we got to get that off my chest. It's like there's a whole bunch of reasons for it. I mean, one of the things that you'll hear if you ever listen to my boss talk about Congress and cybersecurity, he can probably get about 180 seconds, maybe 200 before he'll say something about jurisdiction. And it sounds like the literally the boringest, most inside the beltway thing that you could possibly imagine, and it is. But it's incredibly important, and the reason that it's important is that there are the institutional incentives right now in Congress are not to build up a deep well of knowledge about technology policy, whether it's on the security front, which is really where my interest is, or just more broadly, the jurisdictions of congressional committees were largely set long before the internet was a thing, and they are not reflective of the current, like they are not optimized to be able to make policy on technology. And while that might sound like, great, we don't have to have the government messing around in our stuff, and there's some element that is like, that's true, I do think that we lose a lot because of that and the fact that we kind of run on autopilot. And the other thing is that institutionally, it means that there is not a significant incentive for members of Congress and for committees to invest in a very deep bench. It tends to be, you have a cyber guy or gal, not enough gals, but we're working on it, on the committee, and people are like, oh, it's a cyber question, go ask her, go ask him. Which, if you look at other issues, it's like, no, I would never want to defer to someone else because my institutional power within this organization is predicated on I know the answers to these questions. And so that's like, that dynamic on the Hill is still not fixed. And there are some significant underlying problems that might make it difficult to fix for a while. That's the negative. All right, so now let's talk about the positive. On the positive side, we have seen an explosion in the number of people that are interested in it in the past 10 years that I've been with the congressman. Is cybersecurity has gone from kind of a very niche issue to one where members like want to get involved, and that matters a lot. There's a huge amount of incentive if you're working in a personal office or on a committee to want to get smart on an issue because your boss is asking you questions about it. And there have been a number of initiatives, right, whether at the Wilson Center or the Tech Congress Fellowships, or things that are intended to kind of inject some more, direct from the community knowledge into the Hill, and that's been incredibly, incredibly helpful. But I think that, from my perspective, I do think we need some more practitioners who are willing to get their hands dirty. And by get their hands dirty, I mean, like, it's great to come for a fellowship, but then stay, and there's lots of reasons not to stay. You're not going to make as much money. Your hours are going to suck, except during COVID times, you are going to have to be in Washington, D.C. You can't just, go to Idaho and live near the mountains and Congress from there. But it's a really great mission. And I think you said at the outset, Elliot, something that is, you cannot emphasize enough. We are blazing new policy ground here. It's an incredibly fruitful, bipartisan, nonpartisan arena of we are looking at problems that no one in the course of human history has had to wrestle with. And that's pretty cool. And at least to me, much more exciting than working on tax policy, where, we kind of have a pretty good understanding, like not perfect. And, the economists will argue about, well, how really important is this particular change in marginal tax rate, and how does it change if we go up 10 percentage points? And maybe that's not a settled question, but we have a pretty good idea of the dynamics of tax policy, and we have a pretty good idea of the levers that we can pull. And for cybersecurity policy, we're still making it up, and it's very exciting. So anyways, this has become kind of me evangelizing, but I think that the takeaway here is, like, come work with us. And part of that is be a resource, as Sarah points out. And part of it is just like, come to the Hill and say, yeah, like I want to work here, at least get in a fellowship and ideally stick around for a while.
Yeah, and Nick, I know you and I have talked about this before, but it's hard sometimes to think this way and the kind of the cynical environment that we have sometimes. But members are very responsive to what their constituents want them to focus on, right? So if you are in the information security community, or if you're interested on any area of policy, not just cybersecurity, if you're not contacting your congressman, it's very hard to expect them to be responsive to what you are asking them or you privately want them to focus on. So Nick, I know you and I have had this conversation with folks when the small groups come to the Hill and we meet with them, you know, just telling them to keep engaged. A lot of offices are on receive mode most of the time, so you can send a lot of information. You might not always get a response. Hopefully most of the time you do, but engaging is kind of that first step to make sure that, you know, the elected officials know that their constituents want them to be kind of engaged. Speaking of wanting to be engaged on cybersecurity policy, you know, a big monumental movement was the Solarium Commission. So Nick, can you give kind of a quick 30 seconds background? We'll let you have 45 maybe, on kind of the genesis of the Solarium Commission, and yeah, start there, and then we'll go to Sarah for some questions about what it was like being a committee staffer with a big report like the Solarium.
So I'll try and be short. Let's see. So Solarium Commission is created by Congress. It's a creation of Congress from the 2019 Defense Authorization Bill. It is a very strange, possibly unconstitutional hybrid commission of 4 members of Congress, 4 members of the executive branch at the deputy secretary level. So very senior. You know, this is the second in command of big agencies like the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, and 6 experts from the private sector who range from former head of NPPD, what is now CISA, former deputy director of the NSA, the current CEO of a Fortune 125 power company. And our charge was look at the United States cyberspace strategy and really come up with one that is intended to protect us from events of significant consequence. And in doing so, we came up with both a strategic vision, which we call layered cyber deterrence, which is really doubling down on the idea that, yes, we can affect the way that our adversaries look at this if we take steps, so, you know, so that they will think twice before just going to town on our companies, our military secrets, whatever it is, elections, you know, a variety of things. And then also a series of recommendations, a lot of recommendations, 82 recommendations that the government can then take to implement that vision. So that's Solarium in a nutshell.
Yeah, so you guys came out with a strategy. The great thing is you came up with, you know, specific legislative proposals, legislative text that you were able to kind of get to the committees of jurisdiction, only the Armed Services Committee, you know, and make sure that there were specific objectives and metrics that you guys are trying to meet, and you had a path forward, which I thought was great because I worked with you guys in a lot of the appropriations proposals. Sarah, can you talk about what it was like having something like the Solarium Commission that not only came out with a, you know, report talking about cybersecurity strategy and things we need to do, but actually came out with specific legislative text and proposals to try to move the ball forward?
Yeah, I'll say anytime anybody gives us specific legislative text, that is a gift. It does present its challenges though, because as great as folks are drafting bills, Ledge Council and the parliamentarians here on the House often, I think they're just, that's a whole world of its own. Like I won't even pretend to think that I understand it. I'm not a lawyer. I have haphazardly drafted text on my own. only to be told how wrong I did it. And then I sent it to the parliamentarian thinking, hey, this bill is going to be just my committee, and told then how wrong I am about that. So
I'm sure the commission didn't have any problems like that with the legislative proposals that they drafted.
Nope, all went to Armed Services or us at Homeland. Man, as Nick said, jurisdiction, it's tough, man. Look, I served in personal offices for 10 years. I don't think I ever had a clue until I went to a committee, and even more so, went to the Committee on Homeland Security, how difficult jurisdiction was. The committees that I had my bosses serving on were the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is now my biggest adversary in everything. But fortunately, that's also where all of my friends are, because I spent 10 years working with that committee. But it's ridiculous that we have to argue about, why, this is important, or different things like that. So a lot of my time with the Solarium Commission is like trying to figure out what committees it's going to go to, seeing if I can make changes to small, minuscule words that don't actually change the content of Solarium proposals, to then kick other committees out of my space. And if not able to do that, and then it's having conversations, educating other folks in the committee. Look, my committee, we think about cyber all day. I heard the Solarium, like I knew about the Solarium well before we had any report out there. The Solarium was great about briefing us on these things. Energy and Commerce Committee, they were doing a bunch of other stuff, and nothing against my Energy and Commerce colleagues, but this was something, in the month or two leading up to it, when Politico Morning Cyber is starting to hype up the Solarium recommendations, that's where they're engaging. And that's true for a lot of member offices too. So it wasn't just that this was, it was new to a lot of folks, because most members of Congress and lots of committees are looking at 15 different things. And they may not actually even know the extent of their jurisdiction in the cyberspace until the parliamentarian's office tells them that they have jurisdiction. And I'm calling them up being like, I really need you to clear this bill, because I'd like it to move. And then that's the first time they've ever looked at it. A great example of this is we had one of the Solarium recommendations was the changes to the director of CISA, both in setting a term and pay and kind of scope of that. You would think that the committee with jurisdiction over CISA, the Homeland Security Committee, would get sole jurisdiction of that bill. You would be wrong. Both the Oversight Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee got it. And so Oversight makes sense because they are the government reform and pay, and I can deal with that. But for Energy and Commerce, why does it matter what the CISA director does? And so then it's explaining these things, and not that those things aren't doable, but then it adds time to this. And that's, especially in a COVID year, time is precious when trying to move these proposals, especially because right now we have a lot of people interested in these proposals. You got to take advantage of Congress when you can, and when there's interest around something, like, we've got to move it. At the same time, some things take multiple Congresses to get through. I cannot tell you how many data breach bills I've worked on. We're starting with Bobby Rush's bill almost 10 years ago now. And that issue will haunt me, I think, probably till I die, because that's how it's felt with the data breach bills. And so it's kind of recognizing these things. I think that's a long-winded to say, like, a lot of what I did, it is vetting the proposals, it's hearing from additional folks, but then it's also some minuscule, very DC Capitol Hill things of how do I move this across the finish line, both in dealing with jurisdiction and getting people to come alongside and support it.
Yeah. Process, it's very wonky outside the Beltway, right? It's very hard to win, a political messaging battle on process, as we know. But it is a critically important part of what we do. And if you don't properly plan for the kinks in the process, then you're not going to be successful. So, Nick, can you give us a little bit about, as Sarah mentioned, there were a lot of proposals. You guys have legislative text. How successful do you guys view your efforts with the commission this year? How much work do you guys have to do in the future? And then we'll move on to a different topic.
So, I mean, it's a work in progress. Like to your point, Elliot, in terms of we had a strategy, which was the Solarium Commission was born out of the Defense Authorization Act, which is a giant policy bill that sets defense policy that we pass every year or have for the past 59 years. And we looked at that as a vehicle, right? Like we call them vehicles, a legislative proposal that has regularly 1,000, 1,500 pages and has a lot to do with broad aspects of our national security policy, and said, well, cybersecurity is clearly a part of that, and certainly a bunch of the Solarium proposals directly affect that. So that bill has passed the House and it's passed the Senate, and it is one of the vanishingly few bills that every year still follows the Schoolhouse Rock model of there's a conference committee and, you know, we're going to hash out our differences in what in your civics class in 11th grade you learn is like, this is how bills happen, and is not often how bills happen anymore. But we're, you know, just getting into that process. I think in terms of some of the major things that we've been looking at, two real things that I think are extremely important from my boss's perspective right now is creating an office of the National Cyber Director, the executive office of the president. So this is something that has, you know, we had a White House cyber coordinator for some time, and, you know, going back to President Bush was the first person who had someone who had like cybersecurity in their title as a special assistant to the president. And then President Obama formalized that as the cyber coordinator, and he had two of them, and President Trump had one, Rob Joyce, who's just absolutely terrific guy. But the position was then eliminated by then National Security Advisor John Bolton. And even when we had the cybersecurity coordinator, there was kind of a, you know, it's a staff position. It doesn't bring a lot of, you know, juice to the table in terms of what can the coordinator do. The coordinator is someone who is a staffer, who is the the president's top cyber staffer. Just having that person is extremely important. But Solarium looked at this and said, there are so many agencies with responsibilities, whether it's, you know, the very mundane, the Department of Agriculture is by federal law responsible for maintaining the information security of its portion of the .gov domain. The Enterprise Ag Network is their responsibility. And the Ag Network has a lot of very, you know, sensitive things, whether it's data about farmers that we really don't want people to have access to, or perhaps data about infectious agents that could be, you know, affecting our livestock. So it runs a gamut from that to what we think of as like the core cybersecurity folks, US Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And because there are so many players, the belief from the Solarium folks was absolutely this must be coordinated at the highest level of government. So the proposal that is right now in the House version of the bill would create a national cyber director within the executive office of the president that would have some, in addition to authority to look programmatically across the government and say, hey, you know, what you are doing, Department of Agriculture, is in furtherance of the national cyber strategy or not, whether it's protecting your own networks, or agriculture is also a critical infrastructure sector. And so there are responsibilities there as well. And what kind of outreach are you doing to farms that are now using GPS guided, you know, farming equipment? All of these are like things that you really need someone at the White House to be coordinating so that you have a unified strategic vision for cybersecurity for the country. So that's one major set. And the other set that I'll briefly mention is strengthening CISA. So the commission spent a lot of time thinking about how should, like, are we organizationally set up to fight this fight? And the answer was no, like absolutely not. We don't have anyone in the White House with the proper level of authorities and prominence to be able to coordinate this. And oh, did I mention that Congress is a mess jurisdictionally? That is one of our solarium recommendations as well. But one of the things that we did look at was we said, well, what about CISA, right? New kids on the block. Was this the right call? And are we gonna, double down on where they are, or maybe pull them out and create a new cabinet level agency, or turn it over to someone else? The UK
Department of Cyber.
Right, Department of Cyber, or the UK has put things, with the intelligence agencies. And Solarium batted this idea back and forth consistently for months. There's a lot of reporting actually that was like, oh, Solarium's going to kill CISA. And no, like we absolutely did not do that. We doubled down and said, no, this is the appropriate place for it to live. It has a pretty appropriate mission set. What it doesn't have is maturity. It's brand new, doesn't have the resources it needs, and it doesn't have, shorthand is the power in the interagency process, as in everyone looks at it and is like, yeah, you're the baby here. You've been here for 2 years. So it's kind of, the not just younger, youngest sibling syndrome, where, if CISA comes to the table with a really great idea, everyone's like, sure, go play in the corner. And Solarium is very invested in that not being the case, and in trying to increase the institutional capacity of CISA so that they can perform their mission, which we all viewed as just absolutely vital to the security of both the .gov, the government, federal government, and state and local and elections really at this point, and also the broader critical infrastructure community.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And I know from another, from a personal office perspective, I know that, a lot of things have happened this year, right? We have had no shortage of news or big events happening that Congress needs to deal with. So, maybe the March release, right? It was like a March release of the Solarium report was
the day the NBA canceled the season. Like, we were the last major public event on cyber, at least that I know of. Like, we had a great front row of folks sitting from, director of cyber command to director of CISA, all in the front row, like, this is going to be a great report. We're going to do great things. And I did not attend. That was the last event that I attended with more than like a dozen people at it in whatever 6 months.
And then March 13th happened. Yeah, so certainly interesting perspective there, Nick, on Solarium. I want to go about another 7 or 8 minutes and then try to leave about 10 minutes for questions at the end. But while we're on it, I guess, the coronavirus certainly has made our lives interesting, right? Nick, you're working from home. Sarah, I think you're at home. I'm most of the time at home. I just happen to be in the office today. How has it made your job more difficult? Has it made your job more difficult or less difficult, or being able to make like a big pot of chili while you're on a conference call is kind of a benefit, right? So like, give me a little bit, Sarah, we can start with you about how's the work from home been as a committee staff?
I kind of love this work from home situation. My yoga pants right now are a lot more comfortable than I imagine what I'd be dressed on for a panel like this. In some ways, this has been great. I think the big move for work from home for so many members of Congress has really highlighted some security issues with cyber, and just in general. I mean, I think out of sight, out of mind happens a lot with both members and staff. And so you can't help but notice you're on your computer all the time. What does that mean? Some of those thoughts. At the same time, it's meant we have gone a lot slower. There's usually probably a dozen hearings that we would have done since March. I mean, we've gotten in 2 from our committee, but honestly, I would have expected like 3 or 4 more. That's oversight that we can then share publicly. That I think is really important to be out there and to be seen from both sides. And that makes life a lot harder, not just because we're not together in person, but also because we're doing these over WebEx, and apparently the House Recording Studio has some issues with using WebEx to deploy these. Not just that, the members aren't necessarily nearby, and so not all of them are as adept at using the computer as I would hope for, and so we have people go offline. I mean, I think you've heard the news stories of what's been said in conference calls or this or that. I think even to the state legislature in Massachusetts proposed a bill of like how to use a mute button, which I hope was some in jest, but the reality is like that's something that we're dealing with. That aside, the work from home, there's the challenges in these issues is there is security questions. I think we saw the report from Microsoft last week, that they're fairly certain, China, Iran, Russia are looking at what politicians are doing. How many of our members of Congress are making important phone calls in rooms that have Alexa in it? What are those conversations that are being heard or recorded? And what are the computer networks? Because they're using a personal computer instead of something that our cyber administrators and information technology folks on the Hill aren't installing and making sure that stuff is patched. I mean, I think I get a patch a week, if not sooner than that, pushed down from House IT to help.
Speaking of patches, I don't know if this is a screenshot or someone sharing their screen, but I think they need to update to install some or a restart to install some updates. Those are great points. It's been interesting nonetheless. And another big piece of it is, so much of what happens on the Hill is based on relationships and people you trust, right? And you can't walk down the hallway now, and I can't walk down the hallway and see Sarah or walk down the hallway and see Nick and touch base on those issues that, might be small, but might snowball into something larger. So, Nick, what's it like for, not being able to walk into your boss's office and go over 10 things and check them all off the list and then walk out?
I mean, I just text him constantly. He's so sick of getting texts from me. But, look, I think on the one hand, there are many, many people that we hear from in Rhode Island all the time that have it much worse than I do. So I don't have a lot that I can complain about in comparison to what a lot of people are going through at this time. On the other hand, not having, the legislative staff that I work with close at hand, not having my cybersecurity fellow who we're basically joined at the hip, when we can just walk into meetings together and say, hey, let's chat about this. And it's like, now I have to be a lot more deliberate at being like, oh, yeah, I got to loop Allison into this over and over and over again. It's like, it's tough. I think that, there's a significant understanding now among members that, maybe we need to think some more about what does a hybrid working environment look like, but we have been so reluctant to do that for the entire history of the United States Congress, which is, nearing, will it be what, 225, more than that, 230 something years, right? I guess from the 116th Congress, so 232 years. Like, we have never had to deal with this before, and I get to spend more time thinking about cyber issues. So, at that part, selfishly, I'm like, this is great, and I get to wear my DEF CON shirts around, right? So that is also great. But I do think that it's not great for the institution. And again, my boss was elected in 2000. He was a freshman, 8.5 months into his first term when 9/11 happened. And he, as a national security guy, right, jumped on continuity of Congress then and said, wow, we're just really not well equipped for this at all. And as a freshman is testifying in front of, the Committee on House Administration, one of the the most Congressy of all committees, whose chair is regularly referred to as the mayor of Capitol Hill, and saying, look, we need to do some of this planning because stuff is going to happen and we need to have some capabilities, like we need to have worked into our resilience and ability to function better if we can't be in Washington for whatever reason. And sadly, that just never picked up all that much steam. I mean, there were a bunch of recommendations. You can look in the legislative history in 2002 about, hey, here's a bunch of stuff we should do. And yeah, it's a long way of saying, like, we are not well positioned to do this. And I hope that one of the things that comes out of the broader COVID response is that Congress looks itself in the mirror and says, here's some of the ways we can better work in the 21st century going forward.
As you can see, it's afternoon coffee time in our office. Nick, well, we certainly appreciate you wearing your DEF CON shirt today. I've got my swag shelf like up here that you can't see, but it's got some DEF CON swag from the last few years on it too. So Sarah, you mentioned the Mystic blog post, the Microsoft blog post about kind of the threat actors. And I know that we've talked a little bit about this, but I think that's kind of a new dynamic on Capitol Hill. Like all of this cybersecurity threat intel reporting, it's very useful information, but it's, members of Congress are used to getting briefed by government officials on the threats facing the country and then reacting through kind of a formal official processes that exist in Congress, whether through legislation or sanctions or whatever else you want to use. So the whole new dynamic, I know it sounds ridiculous to call threat intel a new dynamic, but it is a new dynamic on Capitol Hill, in my opinion, because members are getting high quality information from private companies and other, private sector groups in the country. So I'd be interested to know, how does a committee, utilize the threat intelligence from someone like Microsoft or other threat reporting groups that are out there, and how do members consume information like that, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's definitely different. I mean, look, what Microsoft put out last week, I think CrowdStrike put out one, not CrowdStrike, shoot, I'm blanking.
And all the threat groups are named something different, right? Whether it's Microsoft or CrowdStrike, it's always a different name.
I got 3 different reports last week too. This is information that members normally would have gotten in a skip, or in previous times would have been, you'd been in a secured classified environment and you'd walk through this. And I would argue that, there's a level of control over what information may or may not be shared at some point. Whereas now when we are getting it, there's so many companies that have rivals, I would assume, their information, their threat intelligence is impeccable. It's great intelligence. It's helpful to us, and it's available to members and to staff regardless of their clearance levels, and available to the public regardless of their clearance levels. And so it is an interesting way, I think, that it's being consumed, because members are hearing about it from a news alert, because I think very few members are actually reading the intelligence reports that are coming out from these companies. And frankly, like some staff too, like I'm getting hundreds of emails a day. So I saw the Politico Pro, alert about China as opposed to first before I read the actual threat report. So I don't know that I have an answer to your question, honestly, but I think members that you maybe were more hawkish on some of these things previously aren't necessarily people that are getting this information first, because they're not seeing the specific alerts or their staff's not getting it. And so you have different players than I've dealt with in the past about who is pushing, let's get action on this, or what is the action to take. It's also not necessarily coming with recommendations. We don't necessarily have the government officials in the room who can say, like, these are our capabilities, this is what we could do. or, this is X, Y, or Z, but we have people that certainly have those abilities, both at Microsoft and or at any of these companies that are sharing this information. And so I think too, this private-public partnership that starts with these relationships and starts with the relationships throughout the executive branch and these companies, like that is really key in how we respond these days. And yeah, I don't know that there's a real answer, but I think it's different, and we've got to learn to adapt some. I'd welcome a lot of thoughts on that, because I'm still, I think, figuring it out about how to how to do this and do this well for how we can affect change and be better at it.
Yeah. And Nick, I don't know if you have anything to add, but for me, it's definitely a new dynamic, right? I mean, my boss was the former ranking member on the Intel committee, and now he's a defense appropriator. So he has access to some of the agencies and departments that would normally be the governmental entity that would gain information or create kind of this info. But for a member that may not be on any of the defense committees or may not have direct oversight of the agencies and departments, it's a little different, like Sarah said, because they're able to get this, they're getting information. And obviously, I'm not saying that the government and private sector companies have same capability or, have put out the same information, but regardless, it's helpful threat intel. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dynamic is interesting in that regard, although I'm not sure, like, maybe either because, look, the APT1 report, right, that changed government policy, right? There's no question. When FireEye put that out in 2012, 2013, whenever it was, right, it's like that changed the way that the government looks at threat intelligence reporting and the private sector does. And it also, gave us an idea of some of the attribution capabilities, which is, I think, really where mostly policymakers get interested is on attribution, not necessarily on the threat intelligence insofar as a group not tied to a specific nation state or something else has really stepped up their use of, exploiting this particular vulnerability patch now, that no members are interested in that. If you say that group is Russian or Chinese or Vietnamese, members start to get more interested. But at least to me, I think that there is a problem in the cybersecurity community with attribution. It is not an insignificant problem, which is that as domain experts, and we certainly appreciate your domain expertise, there's a tendency, and in fact, this kind of creeps in a bit at the NSA as well, to think that the proof positive at the end of the day is going to come from cyberint, right? Not even signals intelligence. We're just going to call it what it is, cyberint, like the forensics and the things that if you're Microsoft, you're looking for and have really good sensors for. And that is actually problematic, because the attribution part, which again, from the policymaker's standpoint, not from the CISO standpoint, right? There's a lot of really useful threat intelligence in terms of how do I defend my network, but members don't really care that much about that, except at a very meta level. From an attribution standpoint, like, we must rely on all source intelligence, and the community that I'm likely speaking to right now needs to accept the fact that there are a lot of capabilities that the US government has to do attribution that go beyond what you're necessarily going to be able to get from just cyberint. And it can cause a significant problem for policymakers if they get kind of conflicting information from intelligence agencies and what everyone in the public is saying. And I'm not suggesting that people should not put out what they know, but I do think there needs to be some acknowledgement that, the ones and zeros at the end of the day are not going to perfectly provide attribution. And so again, this has been turned into an attribution conversation, not necessarily a threat intelligence one, but that is where the members' minds are at. And that's something that you'll hear my boss emphasize over and over again, is all source intelligence is critical in this domain. And that if we just rely on the cyberint, we are leaving a lot on the table, and we are going to make mistakes, frankly, in our foreign policy and how we respond to this stuff.
Yeah. Those are great points. So apologies, I didn't have the questions tab on my on my window over here. Apparently there was a question a little while ago about should there be a cybersecurity committee. Nick, I think that you guys have recommended that before. So I think the answer to that is hopefully yes. Bryson, we didn't talk about ICS, so sorry, man.
It's all right. I'll get my pound of flesh. I know how to find all three of you.
Yeah. But Sarah and Nick, thanks for joining us. Bryson and the Wilson Center, thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thanks, Elliot.